The girl called out to Lloyd and reminded him of something he had heard many times before, that the freshness of ingredients had a direct and significant effect on the quality of the alchemy produced, and that he himself had always said so. Lloyd replied that he had kept the ingredients fresh. She cut him off immediately, telling him there were no excuses and that what he had brought her was simply not up to standard. Lloyd stood there and thought back over everything. He was 19 years old and had been working at this workshop. He stared at the flower in front of him, the phantom flower, Fleur d'Incel, with a look of pure disbelief. It had taken him an entire week to track that flower down. He had stayed up through the nights to get it, had pushed himself to bring it back within 3 days, and she had thrown it in the trash without a second thought. By every account that mattered to the outside world, this girl was a warm-hearted alchemist and a source of great pride for the kingdom, a flawless genius who had invented countless magical tools and potions. But from where Lloyd was standing, she was nothing short of the devil. She said with clear irritation that everything produced in her laboratory had to be of the absolute highest quality. She added, almost as an afterthought, that this was simply another failed attempt at finding suitable materials. Lloyd cried out in disbelief. The way alchemy worked was that the alchemist came up with the recipes and handled the mixing, while the assistant mage was responsible for gathering the raw materials. Ruby's success rate as a genius alchemist, both in creating recipes and in the compounding process, sat at a perfect 100%. Lloyd's success rate for finding suitable materials, on the other hand, was only 40%. The average assistant mage managed 90% or better. He was aware of the gap. He had always been aware of it. Ruby told him that because of him, the current request was not going to be completed on time, and that the reputation of Ittori had taken yet another blow as a result. She asked him if he had any idea what he was doing to them, and reminded him sharply that his duty was to bring her materials that met her standards and to do so within the time she needed. Lloyd looked down and told her he was sorry. Ruby's teeth pressed together. She raised her voice and told him that if he had enough energy to stand there and apologize, he ought to put it toward doing his job properly. She called him useless, clumsy, and slow. Lloyd apologized again. Ruby's voice rose further. She told him to stop apologizing every single time because it was genuinely aggravating. Lloyd went silent. He thought to himself about all the times he had wanted to tell her to stop, that it was wrong to act this way, to break things in anger. Whenever he had tried, she had told him that someone like him had no right to say anything to her. The world at large seemed to agree with her. He turned it all over in his mind and reached the same conclusion he had been quietly approaching for some time. He simply could not take this anymore. Lloyd closed his eyes tightly. Then he opened them, looked away, and said out loud, he was done. He was tired of being her assistant mage, and he was leaving Ittori. Ruby looked at him with an expression that suggested mild confusion at most. She settled in her chair and said yes, that was fine, and reminded him to be back by evening, and to please bring curry for dinner. Lloyd stared at her with wide eyes and told her he was being serious, that what they had was ending today. Ruby told him that if he wanted to go somewhere, he should just go and not bother walking through every formal step of separating himself from the arrangement. She added, almost as a side note, that his personality could really be quite tiresome. Lloyd shouted out the name of his item storage, his item box. He had made up his mind. It did not matter where he ended up. He just needed to get out of this place as fast as his legs would carry him. Then he glanced at the box and noticed something had been slipped inside. He asked her what she had just put in there. Ruby told him it was a letter asking him to pick up some Earl Grey tea on his way home. She wished him good luck running away. Lloyd seethed inwardly. Even now, even at this moment, she was turning him into an errand boy. Some time later, Lloyd sat quietly by himself and watched the world around him. He thought that at least it felt good to have finally let those feelings out. The question now was where he was supposed to go. Then something else hit him, and he asked himself out loud why he was actually considering buying the Earl Grey. The habit of obedience had been carved into him so deeply that even now it was pulling at him. He pushed the thought aside and looked up at the sky. A dragon passed overhead. Its great wings spread wide, moving freely through the air with no one to answer to, and nowhere it had to be. Lloyd watched it and said nothing. Tears ran down Lloyd's face as he watched the dragon move across the sky. Something stirred deep inside him, and he made a quiet resolution to himself. He wanted to live just like that dragon, freely, without anyone holding him back or pulling him down. A young girl nearby noticed him crying and pointed it out to her mother. Her mother told her in a low voice not to go finding herself a man like that. Lloyd stood up and started walking. He told himself he was going to start his life over completely from nothing. Later, he sat inside a carriage, a book open on his lap, and a lightness in his chest that had not been there in a long time. He thought about how, when this carriage arrived at its destination, there would be a town waiting for him where nobody knew his name or his history. He glanced to the side and noticed a young man and a young woman sitting beside him. The girl's cheeks had gone pink, and she told the boy that his face was very close to hers. The boy said there was nothing to be done about it since the carriage was so narrow and called her by her name, Lyra. Lloyd watched them and felt a strange sort of wonder. This couple had transformed the entire atmosphere inside the small carriage into something warm and sweet just by being next to each other. The girl told the boy that when he got that close to her, she felt as if he could hear her heartbeat, and that it embarrassed her terribly. Lloyd shifted uncomfortably in his seat and thought to himself that he had nothing against them enjoying each other's company, but that he would appreciate it if they remembered he was still sitting right there. But as he watched them, his thoughts drifted somewhere else. Compared to a couple like this, what he and Ruby had always been was something more like a nobleman and a servant. He had to admit, if only to himself, that he had admired her once. She had been so different back then. The memory came back to him clearly. Ruby had called his name and told him not to cry like that. He had told her through his tears that he was sorry, that he was just hungry. She had told him sharply that if he was going to apologize, he should at least stop crying. He had only cried harder and apologized louder. She had told him to be quiet. Then she had held out a piece of bread without saying much and told him that she was going to become the best alchemist in the entire country. That way she could live like a noble even though she had grown up in an orphanage, and she could eat food like this whenever she wanted. She told him to be her assistant mage. He had looked at her, holding the bread, and said yes. After that, the two of them had thrown themselves entirely into their respective work, paying little attention to anything else. They had chased their own goals with everything they had. As a result, Atori had built a real name for itself. Ruby had been recognized and given the rare and prestigious title of Alchemy of Steel, making her a one-of-a-kind noble in her field. And after that, she had changed. She had become completely arrogant, and whatever warmth had once been in her had rotted away entirely. The carriage came to an abrupt stop. Lloyd looked up in confusion, wondering what had happened. The girl beside him said that the coachman seemed to be shouting about something. Lloyd wondered aloud whether a monster had appeared. The young man apologized and explained that the girl had a habit of saying whatever came in her head without thinking about it first. Lloyd told him he really did not mind and suggested they get out and see what was going on. The girl let out a trembling cry and grabbed onto the young man's arm. When they got outside, both of them shouted in alarm at the sight before them, an enormous worm-like creature. The girl asked what they were supposed to do, saying she was no match for something like that. The young man told her not to be an idiot and that nobody gives up before they have even tried to fight. He declared with full conviction that he would protect her even if it cost him his life. The girl looked at him with shining eyes and told him she loved him. Lloyd stood nearby and watched all of this in silence, not quite sure what to do with himself. He felt a pang of envy. He and Ruby would never in 1,000 years have had an exchange like that. He wanted to help this couple. Lloyd spoke up and told them that he had faced something like this before and might be able to offer some advice. The young man said he was so glad Lloyd was there and asked him to please share whatever he knew. Lloyd told them that the creature's weak point was its head, and that if they could slash it there with a sword, it would go down without much trouble. As long as they did that, they would be fine. The two of them stared at him with puzzled expressions. The young man pointed out that the creature was enormous and asked how exactly one was supposed to get close enough to reach the head. Lloyd told them to hype themselves up and think of something. The two fell into a stunned silence. The girl leaned over to the young man and whispered that she had been right. They really could not rely on the quiet man after all. Lloyd bristled inwardly. He had called him an introvert again. Before anyone could do anything more, the monster launched its attack. The young man and woman froze in place, tense and unsure. Lloyd grabbed both of them and pulled them in, then called out a spell. An explosion tore through the air. The two of them looked at him in complete shock, and then a heavy silence fell over the group. Lloyd said calmly that blowing the head off was one way to handle it. The young man pointed out that it had not just been the head, the entire body had been destroyed. Lloyd looked at the scattered remains, scratched the back of his head, and apologized, admitting that his earlier advice had not been particularly useful. The young man thanked Lloyd warmly for his help. The girl, however, was not focused on that at all. She cried out in disbelief, saying that was entirely beside the point, and turned to the young man with wide eyes, asking how he could be so calm after witnessing an attack like that. Lloyd looked at them both in genuine confusion, unable to understand what the fuss was about. The young man replied simply that this was just what magic was it not? The girl told him firmly that it was absolutely not. She pointed at Lloyd and declared that his attack magic was clearly beyond the realm of normal. It was a cheat, plain and simple. Lloyd felt a sharp sting at this. He had already been dismissed as an introvert, and now his magic was being called a cheat on top of it. Afterward, once the shock had settled, the girl turned to Lloyd and apologized for how she had spoken earlier. She said that the explosion magic had been so extraordinary that it had left her completely stunned. She mentioned, almost as a side note, that she happened to be a mage herself. The young man said that was obvious given the staff she was carrying. The girl immediately pushed back and said that was a narrow way of thinking. By that logic, any elderly person carrying a staff would be a mage. The young man asked what the difference would be, pointing out that everyone got old eventually. Lloyd thought privately that the young man really should not say things like that so carelessly. Before Lloyd had a chance to say anything, the girl suddenly bowed low in front of him and asked him to teach her magic. Lloyd panicked and said he was not particularly skilled. She pressed on with great enthusiasm, calling him master and begging him. Lloyd stood completely still for a moment. Master. He turned the word over in his mind. All this time, the only thing anyone had ever told him was that he was incompetent and that the only reason he had any place at all was because he was Ruby's childhood friend. And now someone was calling him master. The girl said she wanted to become a mage who could cast magic the way he did. Lloyd told her he would agree if she could answer a few questions first. She lit up immediately and asked whether that was really true. Lloyd said he was a good person and never lied. The young man cut in and pointed out that a truly good person would not say that about themselves. The girl apologized to Lloyd for all the rude things she had said, addressing him respectfully as master. The young man noted that she was mixing up honorifics and insults in the same breath. Lloyd reached over and patted her on the head. He told her that people made mistakes when they were young, and that all he asked of her was that she use her magic with responsibility. The girl looked up at him with tearful admiration and said her teacher was truly remarkable. She added with great sincerity that she would even be willing to act as a guarantor for his debts. Lloyd startled at being called teacher. He said immediately that he was not really what one would call a teacher. The girl insisted that he was wrong and said she wanted to know more about him, asking who he really was. Lloyd wondered to himself whether these two would still accept him if he told them the truth. He asked the girl whether she knew an alchemist named Ruby. The girl's face lit up, and she said of course. Ruby was the greatest alchemist in the country, an extraordinary person whose inventions had carved her name permanently into history. Lloyd asked nervously whether she happened to know the name of Ruby's assistant mage. The girl's entire energy shifted. She answered at full volume that yes, she knew. Lloyd, the incompetent mage with a material finding rate of only 40%. She said she hated him deeply. She explained that every single time Ruby failed to earn money from Quest, it was always because of Lloyd, and that every time she read about Ruby failing at something, she found herself hoping Lloyd would just hurry up and disappear from the world. She then asked what he had to do with any of this. Lloyd went quiet. Tears gathered in his eyes. He told her, slowly and without looking away, that the Lloyd she hoped would disappear, that was him. The girl went completely silent. She froze in place, unable to move or speak. Lloyd told himself quietly that it was fine to be hated. The young man broke the silence by saying that things had gotten very uncomfortable very quickly. After some time had passed, they arrived at their destination. The girl summed up what she had just learned, that Lloyd had left his role as assistant mage and had come to Minerva for a fresh start, and apologized again. Lloyd told her he was fine. She called out to him and said that he truly was a remarkable mage and that he needed to believe in himself more. Lloyd felt something warm move through him and thought that maybe making friends this quickly was actually a good sign for the life ahead of him. The girl then got excited and suggested he consider a full transformation, something like a fur coat and a mohawk. She said a spike bracelet would suit him too. Lloyd reminded himself silently to stay strong. 3 weeks after leaving the capital, Lloyd arrived at Minerva, the city of life in the Southern Light region. He had had more than enough of people like Ruby. He told himself that a carefree and enjoyable daily life was waiting for him, and that his second life was beginning right here and right now. Or so he thought. A powerful blast tore through the night, sending shards of energy crashing through the buildings around him. A woman stood directly in front of him, looking at something beyond him with fierce resolve, and declared that this was as far as the enemy's evil would reach. Lloyd stared at her in shock. It was his very first day in Minerva. He had never imagined his second life would be in danger of ending quite this quickly. A few hours earlier, in the city of Minerva in the South Light region, Lloyd had looked around with genuine amazement. The journey from the capital had taken 3 weeks by carriage, yet the city was thriving and full of life. Mars explained that the city put a great deal of focus on the adventuring trade. Lyra added that it seemed to form a solid foundation for the local economy. Lloyd turned to them both in surprise and asked whether they were actually adventurers themselves. Mars asked if Lloyd would like to join them. Lloyd declined, saying he did not think the adventuring life was really suited to him. Lyra immediately disagreed and said he was absolutely the adventuring type. She explained that adventurers were travelers who made their living by defeating monsters, gathering materials, and exploring dungeons, and pointed out that this was not so different from what he had been doing as an assistant mage. Lloyd admitted that she had a point. Lyra declared that they would figure out his future over lunch and suggested they eat. Lloyd looked startled at the mention of food. Lyra announced with great enthusiasm that she and her assistant Mars will be helping Lloyd build his second life. Lloyd felt something shift inside him at this. Someone willing to sit down and think things through with him felt like stepping into the sunlight for the first time in a long while. Lyra told him he did not have to put it quite like that, and then asked him why he had been so reluctant to spend anything on food, given that he had already eaten on the carriage. She told him he would never truly leave his first life behind at that rate. Mars asked what Lyra was drinking. Lyra held it up proudly and announced that tapioca milk tea was the most popular thing in Minerva right now, and gave it a perfect score. Mars suggested they get on with eating lunch. Lyra produced a piece of paper and handed it to Lloyd, asking him to write down the kind of job he wanted. Lloyd stammered and said he understood. He stared at the paper, completely lost. His thoughts scattered in all directions, and voices seemed to crowd into his head all at once. One wanting curry, another demanding materials, one calling him trash, another telling him to get to work, another asking where the tea was. He told them he could not think of anything. Mars observed quietly that it seemed Lloyd had given up his own dreams for the sake of Ruby. Lyra suggested gently that he did not have to limit himself to jobs he had already thought about. Something entirely new was also an option. Lloyd pulled himself together, wrote something down, and handed the paper back to Lyra. Lyra read it aloud. Both she and Mars fell into a speechless silence as they went through his second life wish list. He had written that he could not be an adventurer in case Ruby found him, and for the same reason he did not want to explore dungeons. Going back to school at his age felt pointless. He wanted to be outdoors, which ruled out any laboratory work. He would prefer a job that allowed him to use magic, but becoming a mercenary was out because of the smell of blood. Mars remarked that for someone in a modest position, Lloyd had quite a lot of conditions. Lyra said that the reasoning behind his reluctance to be an adventurer was so deeply negative that it was affecting her own outlook just reading it. Lyra brightened and suggested a tool shop. She pointed out that he had plenty of knowledge from his years of gathering materials and that it would not go to waste. Lloyd thought about it and said it was not a bad idea at all. Then his imagination took over. He pictured Ruby walking through the door of his shop, recognizing him, and demanding that he hand over alchemy ingredients for free while looking at him with that familiar cold expression. He broke into a cold sweat just thinking about it, and asked himself what on earth he would do in that situation. Lyra moved on and suggested carpentry. Lloyd looked alarmed at this too, and immediately his mind produced another scene. Himself proudly finishing a new roof and asking Ruby how she liked it, only to have her tell him it was terrible and order him to redo the whole thing from scratch, reminding him that he was nothing but an assistant mage. He began apologizing over and over in his imagination and grew more unsettled by the second. Mars reached over and took his hand firmly, suggesting that they all become adventurers together. Lyra agreed and told Lloyd there was no need to be afraid of Ruby. She said it was a real shame for him to hold himself back from the work he actually wanted to do. The idea that Ruby would somehow find out where he was struck her as far-fetched to begin with. And she reminded him plainly that even if Ruby did show up, it was Lloyd's decision and nobody else's whether he went back to Atori or not. Lyra added that if he was going to become an adventurer, he could count on both of them. Mars told him to give it a try. Lloyd looked at the two of them with tears gathering in his eyes and thanked them, saying they were far too kind. He asked, with genuine feeling, whether he too could become someone like them if he walked this path. Mars told him without any hesitation that he absolutely could. Lloyd closed his eyes for a moment. He asked himself how long he intended to keep living in the shadow of the past. When he opened his eyes again, something had settled inside him. He declared that the Lloyd who was afraid of Ruby was gone, and that from this point on, he was someone new. He announced that he was going to become an adventurer. Afterward, Lloyd walked through the streets of Minerva with a lightness in his step that he had not felt in a very long time. He said out loud that it felt wonderful to walk somewhere without being afraid of another person. Lyra remarked that the fact he was saying that out loud was a little sad. Mars said that regardless, it was a real step forward. As they walked, Lyra glanced to the side and exclaimed at the sight of a bronze statue of a strange-looking old woman. Lloyd told her it was a statue of the saint from the Emerald Church, an important figure who was said to receive divine messages. He warned her that if she called the saint an old woman in the neighboring kingdom, she would be executed on the spot. Lyra said that was terrifying. Mars told Lloyd that he seemed to know a great deal about religion. Lloyd said his goodbyes and told them he would see them at the guild the following day. Lyra looked confused and asked why he was not heading to the inn. Lloyd told her he was hungry and wanted to spend the evening training his skills and preparing himself for his debut at the Adventurers Guild. Lyra watched him go and thought quietly to herself that Lloyd might be a little too much. Mars said he was simply glad Lloyd was feeling better. Not long after, a group of men approached Lloyd on the street. One of them spoke in a rough and threatening tone, saying they were a bit short on money and making it clear they intended to take some from him. Lloyd said to himself that he really did not want his days as an adventurer to end before they had even begun. The man asked what he was muttering about. Then he froze. A powerful blast rang out, and ice spears tore through the air. Lloyd looked up in shock. Ice spears were extremely advanced magic, far beyond what most people could manage. A young woman stood nearby and told the men to stay where they were, that their wickedness would go no further. The men recovered and stepped forward aggressively, asking whether she wanted trouble. The young woman said calmly that there was nothing to be done about it then. Lloyd's mind raced with worry. If she used that level of magic again, the entire area could end up buried in ice. He activated a physical enhancement spell and launched himself at the attackers, landing a punch that put an end to things quickly. He turned to the young woman and told her gently that while an ice spear was a powerful spell, it was also a very difficult one to control in close situations like this, and that a simpler beginner spell would have been more practical. He handed her staff back to her. The young woman apologized softly. Lloyd told her not to apologize at all. She had helped him, and he was grateful. She said she was glad. Lloyd looked at her with quiet curiosity, wondering who she was. She was dressed like a member of the clergy and yet could cast magic of that level. It did not quite add up. Before he could think further, she interrupted his thoughts and pointed out that his cheek was bleeding. He told her it was nothing, just a small cut. She reached out and took his face gently in her hands and told him to hold still. She said she was skilled at healing magic. Lloyd felt the heat rush to his face immediately. She was so close. He had never been this close to anyone, not even Ruby. The young woman paused and noticed that his face had gone red. She introduced herself as Iris. Lloyd stumbled over his words and gave his name in return. She repeated it back to him with a little surprise, and he confirmed it. Just Lloyd. He thanked her and asked whether she lived nearby. Iris told him no. She had actually arrived in Minerva just that day. Lloyd said what a coincidence, as had he. Iris smiled at this, and Lloyd thought the brightness of her smile was something remarkable. She asked him what kind of work he did. Lloyd told her he was an adventurer. Iris said that a mage of his ability must be a truly skilled one. Lloyd blushed and said it was not quite like that. He asked what she did. Iris told him she was currently without work. Lloyd was surprised and then thought to himself that in a way, they were not so different. He asked what had brought her to Minerva. She told him she had come to try the tapioca milk tea. Lloyd said he knew a shop that had it. Iris lit up and asked him to show her the way. Then she stopped and looked up at the clock. She said it was getting late and that her attendant would be waiting for her at the inn. Lloyd smiled at the word attendant and thought to himself that it reminded him of the old-fashioned title princess. He said lightly, in a joking tone, that Princess Iris was going home already and that she was leaving him alone in the dark night. The moment the words left his mouth, Ruby's voice surfaced suddenly in the back of his mind, asking him flatly what on earth he thought he was saying. Ruby's voice in his head called him a useless piece of trash. Iris quickly apologized to him and asked to be excused for her selfishness, addressing him as Prince Lloyd. Lloyd stood completely speechless, his face burning with embarrassment. The word she had used, princess, rang through his mind. Iris then asked whether he could do her a favor. Lloyd said yes immediately, without a moment of hesitation. Iris asked, with a slightly shy expression, whether he could help her find her way back to her inn. Lloyd stared at her in disbelief. Not far away, Lyra and Mars had been watching the whole thing unfold. Lyra admitted she had followed Lloyd out of worry, but now found the situation growing far more entertaining than expected. She said dreamily that it had all the ingredients of a love triangle. Mars told her she was letting her romantic imagination run away with her. Lyra continued building her story in her head, picturing a dramatic climax in which Iris delivered a love letter to the incompetent prince. Mars thought privately that Lyra had been reading far too many strange books. Mars stepped forward and offered to lead the way. Lyra turned on him immediately with sharp annoyance and told him to stop. She was in the middle of carefully arranging the right conditions for the two of them to connect, and if he did anything to ruin it, she would put an arrow through his head. She drew her bow and released the arrow. It struck a building nearby. Lyra cried out in shock at where it had landed, then immediately decided this was a sign from the gods working in her favor. Mars asked her what on earth she thought she was doing and pointed out that she had just shot an arrow into the Adventurers Guild. Lyra declared that happiness could be found when people who shared the same struggles came together and connected through love. A line, she said, from the 125th chapter of a book she was clearly very fond of. She called herself a humble supporter of love and left it at that. Mars wished Lloyd luck in his thoughts. Meanwhile, Lloyd was walking alongside Iris and remarked that he had never imagined she was lost. Iris told him with embarrassment that he did not have to say it quite so plainly. Lloyd stopped as something caught his eye. He pointed out the Adventurers Guild just ahead and suggested she could ask for directions there. The two of them went inside together, and Lloyd began to speak to the people at the front. The men inside looked up at them, and their expressions shifted immediately into something dark and hostile. One of them asked in a hard voice which one of them had done it. Lloyd asked in confusion what they meant. The man's voice rose as he demanded to know who had defiled the portrait of their beloved saint. Lloyd and Iris both froze in place. Another man stepped forward and pointed directly at Lloyd, identifying him as the one who had been holding back the kingdom's finest alchemist, the incompetent mage, Lloyd himself. Lloyd's mind reeled. The man knew his face. Had he been recognized from the capital? And now Iris knew too, if she had not already put it together, that he truly was as terrible a mage as people said. The man continued, shouting that Lloyd was the one who had run away from the capital and was now attacking the guild on top of everything else. The men began to advance. Lloyd told himself that there was no time to worry about any of that right now. He needed to stop this without hurting anyone. He cast a spell. The men cried out in shock, saying they could not break through it and demanding that he stop. Another shouted that something was moving inside him. Another begged for it to stop. Lloyd realized with a wave of panic that he had created a deeply unpleasant situation. One man shouted about his ears. Another called out to someone named Chief and started to say something about the two of them. Lloyd tried to defend himself and explain that there had been a misunderstanding, that they had only come to ask for directions, but his voice trailed off. Iris looked upwards suddenly. She cried out a name, Isolde, with clear recognition. Lloyd asked whether she knew the person. Iris said yes, that Isolde had been her bodyguard knight. Lloyd turned to her in complete shock and asked whether she had said bodyguard. Above them, a woman's voice murmured in bewildered confusion, trying to make sense of what she was looking at. She looked down at the two of them, and her expression broke into one of absolute disbelief. She cried out the name she saw before her, the saint of Holy Roland, Iris Elzerbel Chorut. The woman and the men behind her dropped to their knees and bowed their heads low. They offered a deep and sincere apology for what had happened, saying they had been completely unaware that the great Saint Iris of the Holy Roland Kingdom had been among the group, and that they had repeatedly shown disrespect to her without realizing it. Iris asked them gently to raise their heads, explaining that she normally wore a mask when she was out, so it was only natural that no one had recognized her. Lloyd watched the scene with quiet curiosity and wondered whether this kind of immediate and total deference was simply the policy expected of guild members when dealing with someone of her standing. One of the newer members looked around in genuine confusion and asked aloud what was so remarkable about being a saint, pointing out that she was from a neighboring country besides. An older member immediately rounded on him and called him a country bumpkin who had no idea what he was talking about, telling him firmly that this woman was an extraordinarily important person. The newcomer shrank back and apologized in a hurry. The older member then explained, partly to himself and partly to the room, what a saint actually was. A saint was someone born with a special power, known as holy law power, a force that had the effect of revitalizing life itself and could bring richness and abundance to the land. Without the presence of holy power, a territory would become what was known as uncultivated land, a place overrun by dangerous high-ranked demons where nothing good could take hold. Lloyd noted to himself that perhaps he should have removed the vine from the man's mouth before now to let him speak more easily. The man continued, saying that each country had only one saintess born to it, and that from the moment of her birth, the entire nation devoted itself to her protection. Lloyd turned this over quietly in his mind, and yet Iris had told him she was unemployed. The woman who had arrived, Isolde, turned and fixed a cold look on the men who had raised their fists against the saint. She announced that all of them were being demoted to E-rank adventurers effective immediately, and then ran toward them. The men scattered and fled from her in panic. Iris called out for her to stop and said that since she was no longer a saint, there was no need to punish them on her account. Isolde turned to her with an expression of pure shock and blurted out her disbelief. She asked what had happened to the saintess title then. Iris told her calmly that there was already a new saint in her place and asked her not to worry. Lloyd stood very still as he took this in. She was no longer the saintess. What did that mean? And beyond that, was it truly safe for her to admit this so openly in front of people who were clearly devoted believers? He had no idea what they might do with that information. The room fell into silence. Then one of the men spoke up with great emotion, saying that this was exactly the kind of selfless grace one would expect from a true saint, going to such lengths for the sake of others. Several of the men were moved to tears. Lloyd watched all of this with a slightly stunned expression. Iris called out to Isolde. Isolde, who had also been moved, told Iris that if she said so, she would let the punishment go, but asked her firmly not to lie to her again. Iris insisted she was telling the truth. The men burst into cries of devotion, all shouting praise for the saint at once. Lloyd looked on in quiet disbelief, thinking that this group was deeply, deeply fanatical. Afterward, the two of them stepped outside the guild into the cool night air. Iris remarked that a new day was almost upon them and noted that they needed to turn down the street just ahead. Lloyd said with some amazement that the time had slipped away from them entirely while they had been caught up in that situation. He thought back over what had just happened, feeling a wave of relief that Iris had been there, and then turned to her and apologized. He told her sincerely that she had been pulled into trouble because of his bad reputation, and he was sorry for it. Iris immediately shook her head and said the fault was hers for getting lost in the first place. She told him she did not think he was a bad person at all. Then she smiled and said she had genuinely enjoyed their conversation that evening. She had not known what to do with herself and had simply been wandering around the town alone at night. She said that this ordinary evening was her first real memory as just Iris, not as a saint or anything else. She asked him not to apologize. Lloyd went quiet. He thought about what she had said. Iris had spent her entire life as a saint, surrounded by people who saw her only in that role. He felt as though he understood, in his own way, the particular loneliness of not having a place where you simply belonged as yourself. Iris looked at him with concern and asked if he was all right. Lloyd said he simply wanted to thank her for everything. Iris told him there was no need. Then she broke into a sudden warm smile and told him that when he spoke so formally like that, it made her expect something grand was coming. And she said it with a small, teasing note in her voice, calling him Prince Lloyd. Lloyd felt the heat rush straight to his face. Lloyd looked around in a mild panic, searching desperately for something, anything, that might salvage the moment. Then his eyes landed on the clock tower, and the answer came to him immediately. He suggested to Iris that they go up to it, and she said she did not mind. Lloyd scooped her up into his arms and cast a physical enhancement spell on himself. He launched himself upward toward the tower in a single great leap. Iris screamed from the shock of it. When they landed, she told him breathlessly that he had startled her completely. Lloyd apologized. Iris looked out from where they stood, and her expression softened into quiet wonder. The two of them stood in silence and looked out over the city below. Iris said softly that the view from up high was breathtaking. Lloyd's jaw dropped, and he told her quickly to watch her step. He told her that the tower had been built by a renowned craftsman of the old days, a great goldsmith named Hecate. He shared that during his years of running around searching for materials at all hours, looking down over a town from a high place had always been a moment of peace for him, a small breath of calm in the middle of everything exhausting. Iris glanced at him and thanked him quietly. Lloyd told her to keep her eyes on the view and to wait just a moment longer. Then the sun began to rise. Light spread across the city, and the magic stones embedded throughout it caught the morning rays and began to shine. Lloyd explained that the stones absorbed the light of the morning sun and reflected it beautifully. He said that he had always lived as an assistant mage, had grown tired of everything, and had run away to Minerva with nothing particular to his name. He was nobody especially important, but in this moment, he was glad to be able to share his favorite view with someone he already thought of as a special friend. Iris smiled and said it truly was beautiful. She said with quiet happiness that she wanted to find her own place in this beautiful world. Lloyd smiled back at her. Then Iris reached out and took his hand in hers. Lloyd felt the warmth flood into his face all at once. Then Iris spun around sharply and cried out his name. She grabbed him with everything she had and pulled him back with great force, breathing hard. When she caught her breath, she asked him with alarm and frustration whether he had just thrown himself off the edge as though he had given up on life entirely. Lloyd told her that was not what he had intended at all. He had simply wanted to live up to her expectations and had leaned out a little too far. Iris went quiet. Then she began to laugh. Lloyd watched her with bewilderment. Still laughing, she told him he was a very strange person and added that he had already surpassed her expectations by a long way. She meant that sincerely. Lloyd asked her what kind of life she hoped to have in this new place she was looking for. Iris trailed off thoughtfully and then said that she wanted to spend quiet, easy days together with her new friend. Lloyd repeated the word, relaxing, and smiled himself. Not far away, Lyra let out a delighted and slightly wicked laugh. Everything had gone exactly as she had planned. She spun around to share her triumph with Mars, exclaiming that it had been a victory for what she was calling the coupled bow and arrow. She was met with the sight of Ms. Isolde and her men standing directly behind her, all of them staring at her with cold and dangerous expressions, one of the men holding Mars firmly in place. Isolde asked her in a low and threatening voice to tell her more about this story of hers. Lyra looked back at them with very wide, very nervous eyes. Meanwhile, back in the royal capital at Ruby's atelier, Ruby's voice rang out in furious disbelief. An auditor standing before her told her that it had now been over a week since a particular request had been submitted and remained unfulfilled. Ruby turned to him with desperation and asked whether they could not simply wait until her assistant mage returned. The auditor said he was sorry, but as a matter of procedure the atelier's rating was being dropped to a B rating. Ruby stared at him in shock and called after him as he moved to leave, begging him to wait. Her mind raced. The atelier's rank was everything. It was what made clients trust her, what kept her name at the top. At this rate, everything she had built was going to crumble. Her thoughts turned dark with anger. That fool Lloyd had not come back in 3 weeks. The other people from the atelier had promised to help with her request and then refused her with some nonsense excuse. She raged at the thought of it. If someone as capable as Lloyd, difficult as he was, could not bring back those materials, there was no way the others could either. The requirements were simply too demanding. She kicked the mail post in frustration and shouted her contempt at people she was certain were only obstructing her out of jealousy for her talent. She panted with the force of her anger and then said out loud, as though settling something in her mind, that it was all Lloyd's fault. But beneath the anger, she told herself firmly that one day she would reach the rank of chronicle-class alchemist, just as Hecate had. That irresponsible, useless man was not even slightly necessary for that future. Even if he was gone, there would be a replacement. There had to be. With grim determination pushing through her fury, Ruby told herself she needed to find a new assistant mage, and she needed to do it soon. At the Adventurers Guild, Lloyd waited with growing anxiety, thinking to himself that today was the day he was going to become an adventurer. Without Lyra and Mars beside him, the whole thing felt far more nerve-wracking than it should have. Then Isolde appeared in the doorway, and Lloyd looked up to find her dragging both of them along behind her in a sorry state. He rushed over in alarm. Isolde explained that an unavoidable incident had occurred that morning and that she had needed to question the two of them, then asked whether Lloyd was their partner. Lloyd looked at the state they were in and could not begin to imagine what they had managed to do in just half a day to end up like this. Isolde then turned her attention to Lloyd, telling him she had heard things about him and that she wanted to know more about what had brought him to this town. Lloyd broke into a cold sweat immediately and looked back at her with barely concealed fear, wondering privately what kind of interrogation she had been running in there. The scene from a little while earlier unfolded in pieces. Inside the grim interrogation room of the guild, Mars had called out to Lyra with concern, asking why she could not speak. Isolde explained that she had used silencing magic on the half-elf, saying she preferred not to take risks with a mage. She had then asked them directly what their reason was for attacking the guild, whether it was religious terrorism or whether they had been sent by another country. Lyra had been in a quiet panic, desperately trying to signal Mars not to tell the truth about her Cupid scheme, knowing full well that if he did, they would both be considered completely unhinged. She had mouthed at him say they had been attacked by bandits, and that a stray arrow had gone flying, and to make it sound believable. Mars had looked at her with a calm smile and said he understood. Lyra had felt a wave of relief wash over her, right up until Mars opened his mouth and told Isolde plainly that Lyra had wanted to act as a Cupid of love. Lyra screamed inside her own head. Mars continued without any sign of stopping, explaining that Lyra had a deep devotion to a novel called The Letter of Insulation for the Incompetent Prince, and that she sincerely believed love could resolve any situation. Lyra burned with silent embarrassment. Mars glanced over at her and said in a steady, reassuring tone that he understood her, and that if they were simply honest about her motivations, misguided as they were, people would come to understand. That was what she had been trying to say, he added helpfully. Lyra screamed inwardly that it was absolutely not what she had been trying to say. Before Mars could drag the novel into things any further, Lyra smacked him to make him stop, screaming in her mind that it was her fault and had nothing to do with the book, and more to the point, that he should not be explaining her personal tastes and reading habits to other people. Back in the present, Lloyd stood, trembling as he looked between the two of them, and asked Isolde what exactly the interrogation had involved. Isolde said that just this once she would let the matter slide, but that the two of them would be taking on guild requests free of charge 3 days a week for the next month as a consequence. Isolde's expression grew serious as her thoughts turned inward. She considered what she knew. This man had the ability to incapacitate some of the A-rank adventurers in her guild, and yet in the royal capital, he was known as an incompetent mage. The night before, the St. Iris had arrived in Minerva without any prior notice, and then there had been the incident at the guild itself. Lloyd had been connected to both events. If he was someone who posed a threat to Minerva, she would have no choice but to ask him to leave the city in the name of the guild. She studied him carefully, wondering whether she had managed to draw out his true intentions yet. Mars broke the silence by asking Lloyd casually whether he had registered as an adventurer yet. Lloyd flinched, and then Isolde cut in sharply, asking Mars to repeat what he had just said. Lloyd, caught in the crossfire, managed only to say no before his voice gave out entirely. Isolde announced that the guild was always in need of new members. Lloyd thought to himself with rising anxiety that the test had begun. Isolde told them they were going somewhere now, and that Lloyd would need to touch something called the trial crystal. That, she said, was the test for joining the guild. Lloyd turned to Lyra and asked what the trial crystal was. Lyra explained that it was said to be a hidden treasure with the ability to measure the strength of anyone who touched it. Lloyd asked nervously whether it would be all right. Lyra told him she could not stay downcast forever, and added that the crystal was also useful for vocational aptitude, personality diagnosis, compatibility, fortune-telling, and life advice. Lloyd looked at the long list of things the crystal could apparently do and said there were far too many functions for one object. Then something in the list caught his eye, and a thought lit up in his mind. Vocational aptitude. If the crystal could tell him which profession truly suited him, then perhaps he would not have to push himself into the adventuring life simply because he had run out of other ideas. The possibility filled him with real excitement, and he said he was ready. Lyra told him that was the spirit. Isolde said nothing out loud, but thought privately that perhaps the trial crystal would end up exposing this man's true nature. They traveled for about an hour and arrived at the Temple of the Winds, a dungeon outside of Minerva. Isolde told them that the crystal was kept on the top floor of the tower, and that they would need to fight through the monsters inside as they made their way up. Lloyd asked Isolde whether she had ever touched the crystal herself, and whether it had shown her a vocation. She told him flatly that it was none of his business. A moment later, Lloyd went very still. He sensed something. He moved quickly toward the lower floor and called out that there were monsters below, black spiders and beetles. Lyra asked worriedly whether other adventurers were being attacked down there. A magical spell flew out and struck one of the black spiders. Lyra called out to the other adventurers to get away while they still could, announcing proudly that they were Class B adventurers and that everyone was safe now. Then a spider lunged directly into her face. She screamed and ran. Isolde turned to Lloyd and asked whether he understood the main purpose of the Adventurers Guild. She explained that even with the power of a saint present in the world, monsters never stopped appearing. She swung her sword and released a burst of wind magic at the creatures as she spoke, saying that this was precisely why the guild existed, to eliminate every single one. Lloyd spotted something moving above him and called out in surprise at what appeared to be a magic swordsman. He looked up and saw a spider descending toward him, cast a physical enhancement spell, and threw himself out of its path. Lyra screamed at him to watch behind him. Lloyd cast a bolt of lightning magic, and the threat was dealt with. Isolde watched him fight and noted privately that there was no wasted movement in anything he did. When the monsters had been cleared, Lloyd remarked that beetles were low-grade creatures, but valuable sources of good material, and that the presence of the spiders had actually made them easier to catch. Isolde turned this over in her mind. She began to wonder whether the rumors about him being an incompetent mage were simply untrue. She decided to test him a little and asked what he would do if he came up against a monster stronger than himself. Lloyd thought about it and answered that he would hit it with 16 consecutive bursts of explosive magic to disorient it, and then retreat. As if to illustrate the point, a series of explosions rang out. Isolde stared. 16 bursts of the highest level of explosive magic. Most people would be completely destroyed by that. Even if he was exaggerating, there were far more sensible answers he could have given. There was something genuinely unusual about this man. Isolde called for a short rest. Lloyd noticed the tea being prepared and said he would very much like some. Lyra drew herself up with pride and announced that as a descendant of a noble elf tribe, she naturally kept tea on hand at all times and would serve everyone not once but twice. Lloyd said that all at once he felt like a commoner being waited upon. Isolde then produced food and told him to eat it. Lloyd asked whether she had made it herself. Isolde asked back, in a tone that made clear only one answer was acceptable, whether he was saying he could not eat food that she had made. Lyra immediately said of course not. Lloyd expressed his thanks and took a bite. Both he and Lyra went quiet for a moment, then looked at the food with the same expression of delighted surprise. It was genuinely delicious. Lloyd thought to himself that this was the first time he had ever eaten homemade food inside a dungeon. Lyra told Isolde with admiration that she could hardly believe someone who wielded both a sword and magic was also this good a cook. Isolde replied with confidence that of course she was. As the only daughter of the Lord of Minerva, she had been expected to develop all kinds of abilities in order to live up to her family name. Lyra looked at her in surprise and asked whether she was also a noble. Isolde told her there was no need to treat her any differently because of it. Lloyd asked her then whether the results she had gotten from the crystal had matched the path her training had led her down. Isolde stood up immediately and announced that they were moving on. They began heading upstairs. Lyra drifted close to Lloyd and called his name in a low whisper. He looked at her with a questioning expression. She whispered that she had a strong feeling Isolde was hiding whatever results the crystal had shown her, and asked whether he was not curious about it. Lloyd said he supposed there were things people simply did not want others to know. Inside, however, he was genuinely curious about how the crystal actually worked and what it would show. Lyra looked at him quietly and said nothing more. Lyra added that she had a favor to ask him, though what it was would have to wait until later. On the top floor of the Temple of the Winds, Isolde brought them to a stop in front of the trial crystal. She told Lloyd to hold it in both hands, ask whatever he wanted to know, and it would give him an answer. To demonstrate, she held it herself and asked it to tell her about her abilities. The crystal responded clearly, stating that Isolde was an advanced user of both magic and swordsmanship, and that her adventurer rank was S rank. Isolde handed it over and told Lloyd that was how it worked. Lloyd looked at the crystal with genuine amazement, marveling at the fact that it could understand spoken words. Then Lyra spoke up and asked the crystal directly what Isolde's vocation was. Isolde whipped around and told her sharply to stop, but the crystal had already begun to answer. It announced that it would reveal Isolde's top 3 vocations. Lloyd looked up in surprise, not realizing it would give a ranked list. Isolde turned back to the crystal in a panic and told it to stop, to cancel, to say nothing more. The crystal paid no attention. It announced the first vocation, martial artist, then the second, holy knight. Isolde kept demanding it stop, her voice rising with each word. The crystal continued without hesitation and announced the third vocation, baker. The room went completely silent. Isolde's face flushed a deep red. All 3 of them stood perfectly still, unable to move or speak in the face of this unexpected revelation. Lloyd, scrambling desperately for something to say to fill the silence, managed only to mention that he personally was very fond of sweet things. Nobody responded. Before the moment could become any more uncomfortable, a griffin burst in and attacked. The creature let out a thunderous roar. Mars cried out in shock at the sight of it. Lloyd looked at it in disbelief, saying he had assumed it was a decorative ornament. He shouted at everyone to watch out. In the chaos, the crystal slipped from where it had been and fell straight into the griffin's open mouth. The creature swallowed it without pause and took to the air, flying away with it. Lloyd stared after it in despair and cried out for it to wait, thinking only of the vocation reading he had never gotten to hear. They chased after the griffin at full speed. Lloyd called out for it to stop and return the crystal, and fired a lightning spell directly at it. The griffin twisted in the air and avoided the attack cleanly. Lyra cried out in disbelief that it had dodged Lloyd's magic. Lloyd pressed on, saying they were almost close enough, and unleashed a thunder spell that produced a massive explosion. Lyra shouted at him in alarm, asking whether he was trying to bring the whole tower down. Lloyd apologized and said he had not meant for it to be quite that large. Mars asked why a high-level monster like a griffin was present in this place at all. Isolde told him the questions could wait and that they needed to deal with it first before anyone got hurt. The three of them agreed and moved together down the hallway. Isolde called out, asking where the creature had gone, and warned that the temple became a confusing maze once they left the main path. Mars shouted after the griffin to stop running, calling it a coward. Lyra remarked dryly that it would be wonderful if the griffin actually responded to that. Mars then shouted out a question into the air, asking what Isolde's favorite food was. Everyone looked at him in complete shock. Then a voice answered from somewhere ahead, fluffy pancakes. Mars immediately said he knew where it was. The group stared in stunned realization. The crystal was still answering questions, even from inside the griffin. Lloyd asked aloud whether the crystal would continue to respond, even after being let go. Isolde said she had seen people receive answers after letting go of it. Lloyd immediately called out a question, asking the crystal to describe Isolde's abilities. Silence followed. Isolde told him flatly that it had already answered that question and would not repeat itself. Lloyd looked puzzled and asked why, thinking privately that such a fine answer deserved to be heard more than once. Isolde's face colored with embarrassment. She told him not to worry about her and to focus on more useful questions, then immediately told him not to hold back and to just ask whatever was needed, since she herself did not know what to ask. Lloyd watched her with quiet surprise, noticing just how flustered she had become. Lloyd asked the crystal what kind of magic Isolde was best at. It answered that it was wind magic. Mars asked what her favorite animal was. The crystal answered that it was the rabbit. Isolde shut her eyes tightly and muttered a curse under her breath. Lyra asked what Isolde's favorite book was. The crystal said it was a love novel. Lyra's eyes went wide with delight. Isolde told her with clear irritation to stop and not to look at her like that. Lyra pressed on eagerly and asked what genre Isolde preferred. The crystal answered that it was stories of love that crossed all boundaries. Isolde shouted at them not to dig any deeper. Lyra asked one more question, what Isolde's favorite romantic pairing was. Isolde demanded to know what they were trying to do to her. Then Lloyd's attention snapped back to the task at hand. He shouted that the gap between them and the griffin was not closing at all and said he would cast a spell to speed things up. He used his physical enhancement magic. Isolde asked in disbelief whether that was really the low-level physical enhancement spell, looking stunned by the result. Lyra screamed that they were moving too fast and that she could not make the turns. She cried out that she was going to fall. Mars shoved her out of the way and shouted that even if it cost him his life, he would always do his best to protect her. Mars went over the edge. Lyra screamed his name. Isolde noted grimly that they had just lost a valuable member of their pursuit. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the temple, a group of men were struggling on their way up. One of them complained that he had reached his absolute limit. Another told him that was not the right attitude for someone who wanted to become an adventurer. A third encouraged the group, saying they were almost at the top and that they could do it. One of the men mentioned that he had heard Lloyd would be joining their guild soon. Another asked whether the guild master herself was the one conducting his entrance test. The first man laughed and said it was almost sad. She was genuinely earnest and capable, and yet she walked around in that outfit of hers, and every man in the guild was too frightened of her harsh training to ever form a party with her. The newcomer was probably already flat on the ground somewhere from the ordeal. Then a voice drifted to them from nearby, asking what Isolde's favorite pajamas looked like. The crystal answered from inside the griffin that they had a pattern of bunnies and moons on them. The men stared at the griffin in complete bewilderment. Before they could process any of it, the griffin turned and attacked them. Lloyd shouted that he had finally gotten his hands on the crystal again. One of the men behind him cried out that it was a griffin, then turned to Isolde and asked with wide eyes what on earth this man was. Isolde told all of them to take the newcomers and get out immediately. The man turned to Isolde and asked, in a tone that made clear he could not let it go, about the pajamas. Isolde told him sharply to be quiet and get moving. Lloyd turned his full attention back to the griffin and declared that this time he would finish it. The griffin flinched at his tone. Lloyd fired a water bullet spell at it, but the creature dodged again. Lloyd cursed under his breath and thought that if only he could get it outside the tower, he could end it in a single blow. He steadied himself and said with quiet certainty that he would get the crystal back no matter what. Isolde watched him from a short distance and felt a growing suspicion take shape in her mind. She thought back to what she had heard about him, that he had been holding back the kingdom's finest alchemist, that he was known as an incompetent mage. And yet here he stood, using a wide range of magic with ease and demonstrating deep knowledge of monsters. And still he kept pressing the crystal for answers, kept asking it questions. She thought about the fact that he had arrived in Minerva alongside St. Iris. The pieces rearranged themselves in her mind, and she went still. Could it be that from the very beginning, he had been targeting the crystal? Had he found Iris at her most vulnerable and used her somehow to get close to it? Lyra's voice cut through her thoughts. Lyra said something sharp and quiet about what had almost happened to Mars because of Lloyd, then muttered something under her breath. A moment later, Isolde watched in shock as Lyra cast a silencing spell on the griffin. She asked in disbelief how that was possible, since Lyra had always said she could only conceal her own presence. Lyra smiled to herself and thought privately that Lloyd had taught her this variation of the spell a short while ago, and that her particular strength lay in her ability to adapt and apply what she learned. She moved toward the griffin with purpose, circled around behind it, and struck it hard from the back. The crystal flew from the creature's jaws. Lloyd shouted with joy. They all ran for it, and Lloyd caught it with a wide grin on his face. Lyra dropped to the ground, exhausted. Lloyd laughed with relief and excitement and asked the crystal at last to tell him his vocation. The crystal answered. Lloyd's vocation, it said, was to be Ruby's servant. Lloyd went completely still. The word echoed in his head. Servant. A memory surfaced without warning, Ruby asking him, in that cold and careless way she had, what he had been doing lately that kept him from sleeping. He had told her he had been studying alchemy, thinking it might be useful to her. She had responded with barely a sound, then pushed a lamp toward him with her foot. His notes, the ones he'd stayed up all night writing, were ruined. She had told him not to do anything beyond what he was instructed to do, and reminded him with quiet cruelty that he was her assistant mage and nothing more. The memory pressed down on him, and he felt it all come rushing back. The helplessness, the humiliation, the sense that no matter what he tried, nothing would change. He cried out that he did not want to live like that. Everyone had always laughed at him. He wanted to change. He just wanted to change. Why would life not let him do it? Isolde looked at him quietly. Lyra got back to her feet, said his name softly, and then her eyes went wide. She screamed a warning. The griffin raised its claws and struck at Lloyd. Isolde moved instantly, catching the blow with her sword. She looked at Lloyd and told him plainly. So what about what the crystal had said? The one who decided his life was Lloyd, no one else. She said it with complete conviction. She told him that she herself might have been able to bring smiles to more people if she had become a baker and spent her days making cakes. But she was proud of the path she had chosen, and she did not regret it for a single moment. Lloyd felt those words reach something deep inside him. Isolde turned back to the griffin and attacked with full force, telling Lloyd her plan. She would drive it out of the tower, and then he should hit it with everything he had. Lloyd said he understood. Isolde pushed and struck and drove the creature back step by step until it was forced out through the opening and into the open air. She shouted for Lloyd to go. Lloyd cast a thunderstorm spell with everything he could summon, and the griffin was defeated. Afterward, they returned the crystal to its proper place. Isolde said things were back to how they should be. She then told Lloyd plainly that she had suspected him of coming to Minerva with some hidden scheme in mind, and she asked him to forgive her for it. Lloyd stared at her in genuine shock, not quite believing that was what she had been thinking all along. Isolde smiled and told him simply that he could build something new for himself in this town, and that she was rooting for him. Lloyd let out a long breath and thanked her with real feeling. Isolde turned to the crystal one more time and asked it what Lloyd's favorite food was. The crystal answered that it was potofu. Isolde told him that in honor of passing the adventurer's test, she would treat him to a meal. Lloyd shouted yes with more enthusiasm than he intended. They made their way outside the tower, and Lyra was waiting for them, calling Lloyd's name at the top of her voice. Lyra congratulated Lloyd warmly on passing the adventurer's trial. Lloyd thanked both of them from the heart. Isolde told them they had all done good work, and informed Lloyd that he could now take on quests from the guild once a week. Lyra's eyes lit up, and she asked Lloyd whether he would like to do a guild request together the following day. Lloyd turned to Mars first, and asked with concern whether he was really all right. Mars said proudly that an injury like that was nothing he could not recover from quickly. Then Isolde let out a small cough to draw their attention. She said, in a slightly awkward and roundabout way, that while she was the guild leader, Sundays were her day off, and she usually spent them going on adventures. She seemed to realize only as she said it that she had forgotten what day tomorrow actually was. It was clear to everyone present that she very much wanted to be invited along. Lyra immediately asked Isolde if she would please bake them a cake. Isolde agreed. Lyra then said she would also bring her a novel she highly recommended. Isolde told her firmly that this would not be necessary. The four of them continued talking over plans for the next day. Lloyd stood a little apart from them and watched with a quiet smile, thinking to himself that it seemed like he was going to be all right here after all. Lyra mentioned something about following elven teachings and asked whether that would be acceptable. Isolde said that interaction with other faiths and traditions was always welcome. A few days later, at a certain inn in Minerva, a chef was busy and happy in the kitchen, humming to himself as he worked. He had prepared a fresh egg omelette, ketchup made from ripe tomatoes, consommé soup that had been left to develop flavor overnight, and homemade bread. He carried the tray out with pride and announced to Iris that her supreme morning menu was ready for her, only to stop short when he found not Iris but her maid standing there instead. The maid glanced at him and told him that Iris had gone out early in the morning to practice magic. The chef asked what was to be done with the morning meal he had prepared. The maid told him that the head maid had already brought Iris some sandwiches to take with her. The chef sank to his knees in despair. Waking Iris up each morning with a carefully prepared and refreshing breakfast was the joy that carried him through his days. The maid remarked quietly that Iris seemed to have changed somewhat since their arrival in Minerva. She had become noticeably more active, more willing to go out and do things on her own. The maid wondered aloud whether it had something to do with the influence of a certain mage. The chef sprang to his feet immediately and pressed her to tell him more. The maid, whose name was Sapphira, continued eating without responding. He told her to put the food down for a moment and talk to him. Sapphira told him, between bites, that on the very first night they had arrived in Minerva, Iris had slipped out in the middle of the night on her own. She had met a man by the name of Lloyd, and the two of them had apparently grown quite close since then. Iris seemed to be looking forward to seeing him again. The chef's expression darkened immediately. He muttered to himself in disbelief, then burst out asking why he was only hearing about this now. He declared with rising agitation that this kind of approach, showing up out of nowhere and getting close to someone like that, was the method of a scammer, and then turned on Sapphira and asked whether she too was a scammer for keeping it from him. Sapphira replied that he had simply never asked her. She added, mostly to herself, that this was all very troublesome. The chef, whose name was Nero, demanded to know what Lloyd looked like. Sapphira described him: black hair, tall, and an unremarkable face. Nero announced that he would be accompanying Sapphira on her next escort duty. He took a knife, drew the shape of a man on the omelette, and sliced straight through it. He said with a dark and unsettling cheerfulness that he was very much looking forward to the day he got to meet Lloyd. 1 week earlier, at the Adventurers Guild, a woman looked over the results of their completed mission with visible surprise. The day's collection came to 40 goblins and 20 red boars, with a reward of 3 gold pieces. She pointed out that this particular mission usually took about 3 days to complete and asked how they had managed it so quickly. Lyra answered with great pride that they were simply elite adventurers. Mars quietly mentioned that they had mostly just been standing still for much of it. Lyra hushed him immediately and said there was no need to go into that level of detail. Isolde appeared and called Lloyd's name. He turned to her with wide eyes. She was holding an enormous 4-layer cake. He asked in shock what it was for. Isolde explained that her subordinates had found out she enjoyed baking, and they had asked her to make something for everyone to share, so she had. She then turned to Lloyd and told him that he really ought to try completing at least one request entirely on his own. Lloyd looked at her in confusion. Isolde said that he spent all his time looking after Lyra and Mars. She herself had wanted to make a cake, so she had made one. She asked whether Lloyd had anything of his own that he simply wanted to do. Lloyd said of course he did. He said with quiet happiness that living a slow and easy life was the finest thing in the world. Isolde stared at him, at a loss for words. A series of images from his recent daily routine came to her mind. Lloyd bringing breakfast to others, doing their laundry, offering to clean their rooms. Then Lyra called out to him and asked if he could please make red boar curry for dinner that evening. Isolde scolded them for relying on Lloyd so heavily. She sighed and thought to herself that at the very least, Lloyd should be making more time for himself. The following day, out in the great forest of Vid, Lloyd reflected on how his week had gone. He had taken on several commissions, and the request to defeat 100 goblins over 4 nights and 5 days had wrapped up that morning. He decided to take a short break for lunch and made a plan to finish 3 tasks before the day was out. Then Ruby's voice surfaced in his mind, pointing out that if he used recovery magic, he would not need to rest at all. Lloyd caught himself nodding along and thought that if he pushed through the night, he could probably manage 5 tasks instead of 3. Then the realization struck him and he caught himself with a start. That was the complete opposite of the slow life he was supposed to be living. The imaginary Ruby in his head asked him what he actually did in this slow life of his, and pointed out that he did not seem to have anything he genuinely wanted to do for himself. The imaginary version of her shoved food into his mouth and told him to eat up, then get back to work and come back to her. Lloyd broke into a cold sweat at the image. He pushed it aside firmly. He thought of Isolde's cooking instead. He told himself that he was going to cook something for his own sake. Pot au feu. The imaginary Ruby's voice reacted with disdain at the choice. Lloyd recalled that pot au feu had been the best meal available back in the orphanage where he grew up, and that Ruby had always taken his one sausage from him. The voice said she preferred curry. Lloyd thought about how the pot au feu at the orphanage had been made with nothing but vegetable scraps because they had so little, and said that it had always been his dream to make it properly one day, with good quality ingredients. The voice countered that the water used back then had been carried from far away well, and Lloyd said that the physical effort of that had actually brought out a deeper flavor in the soup. The imaginary Ruby told him sharply to be quiet and make curry instead. Lloyd was jolted out of his thoughts by a sudden explosion nearby. He ran toward the sound without stopping to think. When he arrived at the source, he found Iris floating on the surface of the lake. He called her name in alarm and went to her immediately, pulling her out and asking whether she was all right and what had happened. Iris flinched in surprise at the sound of his voice, clearly embarrassed to have been found in this state. She explained afterward that she had been practicing magic near a river close to Minerva, that something had gone wrong, and that the current had carried her all the way here. Lloyd thought silently that Minerva to this spot was a 2-hour journey by horse carriage. Iris began to say that if her servants did not find out about this. Lloyd interrupted and asked who she meant. She said her servants, and added that she was sure they were already worried. Lloyd told her he would bring her back to them once her clothes had dried. Iris thanked him warmly. Lloyd suggested a meal in the meantime, and told her he had made his favorite dish. Iris looked pleasantly surprised. Lloyd lifted the lid of the pot, and then went completely still. Iris looked inside and asked whether his favorite dish was curry. She said with delight that it was hers too. Lloyd broke down in tears, trembling with frustration and telling himself that he could not even cook his own favorite dish properly. He called himself useless. Iris looked at him with confusion, then quietly picked up the ladle and tasted the curry herself. While Lloyd was still sinking into disappointment, Iris said softly that it was delicious. She smiled broadly and told him that his cooking was genuinely very good. The relief that came over Lloyd was immediate, and he thanked her. He told her that curry happened to be Ruby's favorite dish as well. Iris asked who Ruby was. Lloyd explained that Ruby was a childhood friend of his, a mage, someone who had set her heart on becoming the greatest alchemist in the kingdom. He said she was a truly remarkable person. He smiled a little as he said it, then added that he himself was someone who had simply done what he was told and helped Ruby along the way. Iris told him that she found that admirable. Lloyd looked at her with surprise. Iris said that no one succeeded at anything without the help of others, and that even if the two of them had now gone their separate ways, the fact that Lloyd had helped Ruby did not disappear. She told him that being someone who could help other people was something genuinely wonderful. Lloyd looked at her quietly, moved by her words. He thought to himself that if he could spend his slow and peaceful life alongside someone like Iris, that would be something truly wonderful. Lloyd said aloud that he had believed everything would be fine once he put distance between himself and Ruby. But coming to Minerva had made something clear to him. If he did not change as a person, nothing around him would change either. He caught himself and apologized suddenly, saying he had talked too much without meaning to. Iris told him not to worry and said she understood. Lloyd asked whether she really did. She said yes, and then after a pause she added that the reason she was no longer a saint was precisely because she had not changed when she needed to. A quiet settled between them. Lloyd thought to himself that when it came down to it, he still knew very little about who Iris actually was. Far away, on the other side of the lake, Nero had his telescope trained on the two of them. He went very still as he watched. Then his expression shifted, and his voice rose with barely contained fury as he demanded to know what Lloyd was feeding to Iris.